Welcome to the 11th episode of Oral History podcast series, a journey through the past, present, and future of mining. I'm your host, Mónica Ospina, and I'm here with Priscilla Nelson to dive deep into today's complex yet crucial discussions about time, power, and community engagement in the mining industry. Our guests, Glenn Sigurdson and Luke Danielson, both experts with years of experience in conflict resolution and sustainable development, have brought forward some truly thought-provoking perspectives, from the perception of time across industries and communities to the sensitive balance of power between mining companies, governments, and indigenous communities. We are exploring all of it today.
These concepts of power and time are so important. And what really struck me today in today's episode was how something as unseemly straightforward as time can become a point of contention and conflict, shaping project outcomes and community relations. Glenn, Luke, and you, Monica, each share unique insights into how timelines can clash, not just between corporations and communities, but within the complex layers of government and societal expectations. Stay with us as we unravel these layers, exploring what it means to approach mining projects in a more inclusive and thoughtful way.
It's all about time. Think about time ahead of time. It's not surprising that time is the most commonly used noun in the English language. What divides people across worldviews is different perceptions about time, and what divides organizations internally is different responsibilities that work on different clocks. Different professional training sees time in different ways, from geological time over millions of years to the critical path of an engineering project, from the glacial speed of time in the evolutionary processes of the world to the immediate moment in which we're working. Everything is about how you set the clock, how you watch the clock, and wake up alarms. Think of all the ways and expressions that we talk about time: ahead of time, behind time, all the time, beginning of time, end of time, time's up. It's about time. Time is the most significant critical variable that always characterizes problem sets of any kind, but most specifically is a powerful vector drilling to the heart of many sustainability issues. So it's all about time. Luke, do you agree?
Well, it really is the critical underlying issue in a lot of the problems we have, the conflicts we have. Our organization works with a lot of governments, and we advise governments, among other things, about how to develop permitting processes. And one of the things that is critical to mining companies is that they have deadlines by which they have to get things done, or their loan commitments expire, or the ability to hold on to land positions expires. So they have very hard deadlines, often in a very short time. So what we're seeing when we talk to governments about consultation with Indigenous people, for example, is companies stepping in and saying, we're all in favor of consulting with the Indigenous people, but they have to understand our deadlines, and they have to make up their mind in a very limited amount of time. I've heard meetings where people say, a complicated project that's taken the company 10 years to design, okay, we're happy to hear your opinion, but you have to give us a yes or no within 30 days. This simply doesn't take into account the perspective on time of the Indigenous community, and it's not even polite, really. Nobody barges into my own living room and gives me a deadline of 30 days to decide whether I want to move out of my house or not. But that's often the kind of issues that communities impacted by mine development face.
And it's not just indigenous communities, just to drill into your last point, it's any community of any kind, and often many sizes. There is an expectation that the company brings into the equation that we're going to set the clock, and it's got to be to our clock. And if it's not, then there won't be a project because, as you say, there's going to be a finance window lost. So that's one key area around project development. Monica, is there other aspects of time, or do you want to add into this whole area on project development and the critical nature of time?
Well, I think that honestly, the industry hasn't played around planning for time, and that is part of the issue. And the point that Luke has made is basically for the traditional reactive approach of the industry around early engagement. Because if you work on early engagement from the very, very prospecting phase, you will have at least 5 years of ongoing dialogue and open conversation that when the project, because the project is not suddenly, the project seems that it has been a study and feasibility, probably economics and the nature of the deposit are in favor. It is a process that has taken at least 5 years. So if companies are missing the window of 5 years, means that they mismanage the time as a resource. So I agree with you, Luke, and I have seen many cases that they are suddenly sent a letter and guess what? Or when resettlement happens, for example, which is even worse. And the community didn't even know what was the status of the project. So if you don't have a professional early engagement process and open dialogue with communities, it is going to be a source of conflict. Even more in the fact that if the community doesn't know what is the project going to look like because it's a secret or it's confidential, I mean, everybody knows where the mine is going to be. Everybody knows in the town where the concession is. So if we just keep it secret, we just put it pressure in an unnecessary situation that creates conflict. So I will add that to that. And I think that we are mismanaging time as a resource, and that will be how I see this.
One of the things that obviously is a concern is even people in the industry who are very sensitive to these concerns. I hear questions back like, well, okay, but what is a reasonable amount of time? How long should we expect to wait? And I guess the thoughts I have are in a couple of situations that I think were mismanaged by industry early. One of them, Jabiluka in Australia, the uranium deposit. Indigenous people started a great movement and got all kinds of environmental allies and people all over the world, and it turned into a huge conflict. And ultimately, Sir Robert Wilson, the CEO of Rio Tinto, got a lot of recognition for it. He went out to the site, right? He left his boardroom in London and went out to the site, and he sat with the village leaders, listened to them respectfully for a considerable period of time, and then said, I give you my promise that we will not attempt to develop this project until you are in agreement. They then sat and have had dialogue over this project for really a long period of time. I think it was 2002 that he met with them. It's now over 20 years later. There's a positive sign in that the community and the company are still talking to each other. They've become very friendly and they have great relationship, but they're still not ready to develop the mine. And now that the price of uranium is shooting up and everybody's all excited, the pressure to go forward is great. And the question I get from people in the industry is, well, 20 years and we're still talking. My take is from the point of view of many of the communities I work with, 20 years is a very short period of time. And they look back to things that happened 50 years ago or 100 years ago. And they don't really feel that 20 years, there's anything particularly outrageous about wanting to work something out over that period of time. In the meantime, the mining company people, this is really what they do, is try to get the permit. The people in the village, they have to sow their crops, they have to harvest their crops, they have to take care of their children, they have all kinds of other responsibilities to do, and they can't be spending 6-7 days a week going to meetings to try to sort this out, right? And so there you go. You have company people who think it's outrageous that something after 20 years we haven't gotten anywhere, at least if you measure it by do we have a permit, and village people who say, well, we're still not done. We've got things we still want to talk about.
I confront this, challenge in most of the situations in which I work. So let's just set the context in which I'm working. When I'm asked to become involved in one of these from any one of a number of different parties that may be involved in it, whether it's environmentalists or farmers or miners or community members or whomever, the question is, what do we need to talk about before we actually start talking about a mine or a logging company or whatever? What is it that we need to establish as clear understandings about the way we're going to work together? And a critical question that has to be talked about at that early stage is time. And each party has to talk about it. Now, if there is a motivation by the community to somehow be part of this project and benefit from it, and vice versa, the community benefiting from the mine benefiting from the involvement of the community in terms of permitting and risk management and opportunity horizons, then we each have to say what we're going to need in order to work together from a time point of view. The company may say, look, we've got financing windows and there's only so long we can hold off, et cetera, et cetera. And the community will say, well, we just simply can't work that fast. And the government will say, we have to do this. So the whole question about how we manage time becomes crucial, because the company is worried that they're going to be dragged into an endless process in which they can't possibly know how they're going to get out of here with any degree of dignity. The community has no sense of when they're going to be able to meet the expectations of the community members who are asking, well, what the hell's going on here? So I have learned in my business that we have to have a clock running. And if the clock can't be established, there is really no basis to move forward into the conversation. Now, the way I manage that often, just to expand further, is let's set the clock for 6 months and we'll see where we are. And then we will revisit the question as to whether we need to extend the time. And we will only extend the time if we think we're making progress. But at any point, if you're having this conversation, you have to be able to say, well, that's just not working, and we're not going to be able to develop here at all, or else take the risk of just barreling through and facing opposition. So I really believe that it is absolutely crucial to think about time as something you have to talk about with each other at the very beginning. And if you don't get clear expectations of how it's going to be managed, you're just heading for real difficulty of the kind you just described. It just goes on and on and on, and everybody gets completely frustrated with going nowhere. So any relationship between people that doesn't somehow take into account time in an explicit way is really heading for problems. Just like if I didn't have an alarm clock, I might sleep forever. Maybe not.
Well, it goes back to the same thing, Glenn, what I was saying before around the time and around the setting the alarm clock. I really like the analogy. But the point here is that to be conscious of the nature of what is having a potential project, which is a very difficult thing to know. because you start from the unknown. If that will be an interesting potential, well, geologists are the most optimistic ones, always believing that that might be something and they will discover something important. But the point that I see here is that I see it as a pure lack of planning in many ways, and the challenge of dealing with the non-financial, the very difficult to measure elements, is one of the things that is struggling us. And the fact that mining starts from a very scientific perspective, where everything you can measure and everything you can have by facts, and the success of mining depends on the non-financials, is a very complicated and abstract element here. I think that we really need to find an understanding and balance on that, because communities have different sense of time. Communities have a different sense of what is approval. The permitting process doesn't mean that the communities agree with that. There is a lot of discontent of many communities around the world on how permitting processes are. The free, prior, and informed consent is kind of a standard that forces us to engage communities, but it's not necessarily exactly what communities will agree or would like to have. So there are so many abstract elements out there, and very difficult for companies to kind of standardize, and for the industry to standardize, and even for communities to understand. Just keep in mind another thing, that we know the industry, but the communities where the projects are going to be, they don't know the industry. And we expect them to be at having that understanding. And that takes a long time, not only to educate, but to assess the living conditions and the level of impacts. And not many companies even really assess impacts.
Let me just take you back to your earlier comment, which I think is extremely important. The importance of getting involved and sharing information in the initial stages of the project. Because in a way, the way we manage time is a direct reflection of the amount of confidence and comfort that the community has with the company, and has had a chance not to get caught off guard, not to be surprised. Because the one thing that makes one hyper sensitive to time is if somehow all of a sudden somebody comes bursting into the scene and says, we've got a timing window of 6 months or the capital is going to erode on this project. So time and trust and early engagement, I think, is a very important element in managing time.
I agree very wholeheartedly with what you were saying about, if you are going to have a productive discussion, you need to have the discussion about the discussion. And all too often people say we're in too big of a hurry to spend a bunch of time doing that. But the reality is, you need to sit there and talk about what are the ground rules, of our discussion. And one of the questions is, does the project stop in its tracks while we talk? In other words, at one end, you could have a agreement that the company won't do anything on the ground to try to move the project forward until the discussion allows them to do that. Or you can have the other extreme, which is the company's free to go ahead and pursue its project according to its own time plan, and we discuss things while the project is being built, right? And the community is very upset about that alternative usually, because they say, you'll just pay somebody to sit here and talk to us until you got your project built, at which time there won't be much more to talk about. And the company's point of view is, well, you guys will sit here and talk to us forever, because as long as you're talking, we can't do anything. And so that whole question of the ground rules for the conversation is, I think, critical to resolving these problems.
And what about the government in this? Like, increasingly, there's demands, particularly from industry, and I think they're going to accelerate now with this further security driver around, the critical minerals and everything from security to climate changes becoming involved in that. There's going to be increasing pressure for the environmental assessment processes around these projects to be driven by very strident timelines, and that certain things have to happen by a certain time. And it really creates a much more tense environment when you look at what we've just shared together about the discussion about the discussion. So where's the government going to fit into all of this, I guess, because that's going to be a key and important driver. And I don't think there's been one review of environmental assessment legislation that I've ever been aware of where there isn't a whole discussion about the need for clarity and speed and certainty, et cetera, from a government point of view.
I just have to say that what I all too often see is when we're drafting a law or the government's drafting a law and we're trying to come up with a just and reasonable way to do things, there are people in industry who will count the steps. Oh, we have to publish this by this time. Then we have to have a public meeting by that time. They count all the steps and figure out what are the deadlines for each of the steps, and then what is the total permitting time if we follow all these steps. And I think most of the people who are really thoughtful in industry are thinking that's not what we want to be doing, because we may wind up with a permit, but with a just rancid relationship with the community that we're going to have to be working alongside for the next 20, 30, 40 years. Right. And if the price of getting quick permitting is a terrible relationship with the community, most companies today, I don't think, feel that's worth it.
There is another element here that I would like to add, is the political will. And we are seeing that as democracy and somehow in some places is eroding, we find that politicians and government officials all detach themselves for the risk of approving mining projects. So one way on this is that we need, once again, talking about timeline. When we have these politicians in power, we have it for 4 or 5 years in some democratic countries. And that is also short-term thinking for a long-term project. And their interest is the immediate considerations that once again put us into the pressure, not only in the finance, but the permitting side. And apart from that, right now we are seeing that public participation for permitting is kind of the safest out for politicians not to get involved with mining projects, or the disapproval or the risk that will have on the reputation or the relation they have with their people. And they just place that on the people in the communities to say, well, based on public participation, we will grant permits. And that takes us again to the risk of not managing time and not having a quality in the engagement process that allows to educate communities and at the same time have an open dialogue, the discussion about what the project is and what the project cannot be. Because keep in mind that also the reputation of the mining is that many times we have a lot of projects that are not a go, and communities set expectations that the project could be, but that is part of the honest and trust building discussion is this, we are doing exploration and might not be a project.
If you really drill into what an environmental assessment is, it's really about information informing the project's development. And it's information informing the communities of interest that are around the project that could be impacted. It's fundamentally about information. And in the discussion about the discussion, if we're going to talk about time, we also should be talking about how we're going to inform as to what the various implications of this project are from multiple points of view. And if, in fact, part of that discussion includes a discussion about how and who the experts are going to be that inform it, and we can reach joint understandings around that early, we expedite potentially very significantly the assessment processes, which is all about time. So managing time also involves understanding the implications of not managing it well. And in the case of environmental assessments, if there is immediate distrust in the community by the experts that have been unilaterally chosen, we know invariably that the risk that you speak of, Luke, is going to be that much greater, that it is going to negatively impact the relationship. And while you may ostensibly be fast-tracking or speeding it or getting greater certainty, you're actually achieving a much greater risk. So I guess the bottom line is that so much risk management and time management can be dealt with in the discussion about a discussion.
I've been studying recently some environmental impact assessment processes for mines in Sweden, right? And one of the things that I think would be a great subject of discussion, what they're doing is they're hiring the community to write the environmental impact assessment sections that have to do with describing the existing landscape, describing the resources, describing the communities. So the idea is instead of these experts who may not be trusted coming in from outside, I honestly, I remember talking at one point to some people who were doing water quality sampling at the site of the proposed Pebble mine in Alaska.
Right.
They were helicoptering in, taking water quality samples. And I said, why are you doing this? Oh, well, we want to know what impact might occur on the salmon. And I said, well, you're right next door to this indigenous village. These people have been living by fishing salmon for thousands of years. Why don't you ask them what they think? And the answer really was more or less, well, they don't have doctorates. So we wind up parachuting in and doing and I would think that you're going to get farther if you hire the local community to write the part about the resources they depend on than if you have outsiders coming, parachuting in and doing. So I kind of like that idea because from the beginning, it has everybody collaborating, right? The community's writing a portion of the description of the baseline the way they feel it should be written, and they're the local people, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's a really nice example of something that might be a positive improvement in the way. Honestly, I've seen baseline written by people who never left their office in Toronto, right?
Right. Yeah.
They're using satellite data and things to tell us what's happening in the Colombian jungle. My point is simply that the information needs to be trusted, and that co-development of the information is probably the process of the future.
Right.
I had one project in Ecuador precisely look on that, and I remember that the remoteness of the project, and at the same time we were in the Bosque Protector del Cutucú, which are indigenous. It was the best way to work on the baseline was having fully involved. We didn't have land rights, so there was a lot of elements of the abandonment on the indigenous in this part of the Amazonia that creates actually an opportunity. Because it's dialogue. Dialogue is not only sitting down. Dialogue is when you go with a group of geologists and you go around the land, when you sampling together, when they know what is a sediment sampling looks like, when they know the location, when they know the boundaries between clans, because it's also sometimes conflict between clans. So when you work on the project and we make science factual and easy for people to understand, that's credibility. because they went there, and when they go home, they say, guess what? This is what I did today. And guess what? Yes, this is number of women or men in my community. Because at the point, adding to the point that Luke was saying, I think that a high risk of having environmental and social impact assessment done away from the region and with no involvement of the people, we are already putting a project in risk, a huge risk. Not only the risk of not having the approval from local communities, but the huge risk of assessing something that we don't know if it's factual. And another piece here that I would like to add, Glenn, is that keep in mind that many companies, when they are doing the baseline for environmental impact assessments, they want to be the closest to the concession, and the areas are very small. Because obviously the accountability, they want to have the less and the smaller accountability on the project and the impacts. But when you add the social cannot be that small because the remoteness and the locations of towns are farther. So if we're trying to be so cheap in trying to have a very, very narrow area, we are putting the project in risk because it's already non-going for approval. So you are putting 100% of the risk on the project because you just want to have a very tight corridor that are on the concession. So I think that sometimes when we try to be too smart, we are not very smart. And I think that happens a lot. It happens a lot here. And have people involved. I remember on that project, it was interesting because I had the Ministry of Mining calling and say, how come in Ecuador it's very rare that you have a project that is not conflict, no? So how come we never heard about your project? We said, well, because we are the cheapest project for their country. We haven't used a police. You have never had to pay gas to put on the police card. You didn't even pay for a Band-Aid in a hospital because of that. That's a project you want. You want a cheap project. But the whole success was dialogue was walking. Dialogue was going with them. Dialogue was teaching them. Dialogue and trust was giving them a GPS. I trust you with a GPS. So that is what we need to achieve.
You know, we all work with the assumption that information is good and the more information is better. But, you know, I've learned that information is also a weapon. You got your facts, I got my facts too. We all got our bloody facts. And that becomes a flashpoint. So it really takes us to the point you were making, Luke, is it's not about the information. It's about how the information is developed and who is developing it. Because otherwise we're going to run into, you got your facts and I got my bloody facts too. And so there we are. And the next thing we have is a discussion that a community or the government saying, well, you have to hire you have to pay us to hire our own experts, and on it goes. It has enormous capacity to go downwards. And so I really believe that managing time in an effective way is about managing how we inform and trying to come to a better understanding about how it is we're going to inform what this project and its implications are. The second thing is it's how it's done, the interface with the fishermen, or the that you spoke of, Luke, and the interface with the community members of which you spoke, where they go around in the land base. There's enormous power in a double-barreled sense of both of those things, because every time those conversations are happening in the discussion about a discussion, people are building confidence in each other that maybe we can work together on something here. And that's huge confidence building. So I again kind of circle back that building trust is about managing time. And if you try to rush people into something, they get immediately suspicious. They just, like, what's the big hurry here? Why you? They may actually be happy that we're trying to move forward, but the way it's being done is really upsetting me and making me quite nervous, kind of thing. So I think this is quite a rich discussion around these issues that we've surfaced here. I
want to bring this up in practical terms, right? And the kind of issues people face, right? So I was working on a project where basically the a bunch of really significant social issues came up with the community, and it involved, as so often is the case, road building, and are we going to build roads through these undisturbed areas that are full of wildlife? And at any rate, so what happens is that the company, when we really drill into this, the issue is, well, we can't stop now to think about this because we have a construction company that's come in from Canada. We brought all their big yellow machines in on barges, and we've got all these people on site, and we have to pay a certain delay payment every single day that they're there. And so we have this agreement with them where we're essentially, and it's only reasonable. They say, well, we brought all our equipment and our people out, and they're sitting around, they're doing nothing. And then the question is, well, why did you bring all these people out there before you had all these issues resolved? And the answer is, well, in our loan commitment, we have to meet a deadline to start construction. And our bankers tell us that we won't be deemed to have started construction until we actually start digging things up. So we had to sign a contract with the construction people and bring them all out there to prove that we met this deadline for starting construction. Well, where was the consultation with the local people about that? And the answer is, well, there wasn't any. It was a two-way discussion between the company and its lenders. So I think part of the problem is that a lot of the players aren't actually at the table, right? The construction company isn't at the table. The lenders aren't at the table. Others who have a big influence on how this project is going forward aren't part of the discussion. Do you think there's a way to, what do you think? Is there a way to get some of those parties? You talk about how when people have dialogue, it informs their understanding of what's going on, which means to me, if the bank or the construction company or somebody else isn't part of the discussion and the dialogue, they're missing all this information.
One of the things in which you're discussing at the very beginning is how we're going to get the information that we need. If what your goal is to build some kind of relationship, and you've started to try to figure out how to get the clock running as soon as we can get it running, and create windows of opportunity to keep on talking about how the clock is doing. At the same time, we're going to be having, that we have discussions about what we were talking about before, it seems to me, around environmental assessment, how we're going to inform that. The question inevitably arises, who else has got information that's relevant that we're going to need to know about? And that really involves finding a way to surface that earlier rather than later. That should be built into the approach and discipline of the planning process from the earliest point. Like, what are the various factors here? And so the question of who and information are kind of inextricably intertwined, but even more deeply, just to go on for a second, it also starts to inextricably wind the different value perspectives that people have got around it, because time takes on different intonations depending on your worldview. And so all of these things start to become more explicit in the conversation than they would otherwise be. And I think it's natural.
Well, I think that goes back to where we were talking before about time and all of this, and the quality of the baselines that Luke was pinpointed. And this is exactly the same to the stakeholder mapping. If we are educated in understanding all different angles of the project and the sensitive areas that are in the region and the history of the region, because let's keep in mind, Glenn, as a mining project, we arrive in a region that has history itself, history of differences between clans, history of colonization, history of industries and conflicting for resources or labor, anything like that. And that are information and stakeholders that will be critical. And the quality of the information for the successful engagement process goes, and it takes time, because from each dialogue with communities nearby, we will find new stakeholders that might not be immediately in the region living there, but they have a great influence and could be in major cities. And not having that time for that conversations will create a challenge, because we will have a huge gap about who is who and who to talk and what to talk to who. And now with social media and the influence of NGOs or anti-mining groups, they're not necessarily nearby. They could be in Switzerland, but they could be in the US and interfering in the relationship, or create a new set of expectations for communities, or questioning communities about the validity of the project. And we are missing that by not having a very good educated and completed stakeholder mapping and stakeholder analysis. That takes time, once again.
Well, I guess stakeholder analysis, stakeholder mapping, those are good words, and they're fancy words for something as basic as who do we need to have part of this conversation, who can help move it forward, and who can stop it in its tracks, and who's going to be critical to implementing it. So my view of stakeholder mapping is those three questions. Those are the questions I want to talk about. And that fits very spontaneously into a conversation between competing different points of view. And so much of this just makes common sense. We don't need common sense. Is who can help us or can hurt us on this deal, and why? How do we get them involved in it earlier rather than later? And that's really the essence of risk management as well, but also opportunity management. But some of the critically difficult issues around this arise because who could involve another community that is a different view, proximate to the mine, but a little bit further distant? And so you get these complicated dynamics where there's multiple communities in a region with slightly different orientations. Or there's a view, why would we get those people involved? Because they're going to slow the whole bloody thing down. That's the other thing. And so this whole business about who's at the table really directly impacts on time as well, because if in fact we don't somehow engage in some way or another with the adjacent community or the player that's going to be seen as obstructionist earlier rather than later, you can end up just postponing what was a problem around time into a big hairball of a dispute. And so then you've really got a time management problem. That's kind of what I've seen, and I can think of very explicit settings in which all of that is played out. Very explicit. Monica, your thoughts on that?
Yes, I think that you just nailed the point, but let me add a cherry on top of the cake, Glenn. How about due diligence? Not all the stakeholders are legal in many areas. And sometimes you have to do a due diligence on some stakeholders that are in the region, because could be a case of drug trafficking, could be a case of money laundering, could be a case of human trafficking. I mean, you name it. There's a lot of things around that. And the due diligence is a very challenging, confidential, and demanding process that, once again, takes time. But it's critical also because, put it this way, not having that, we might end up having as a major supplier an organization that is just going for money laundering and that. So that is also part of that analysis that is critical.
Yeah,
and
no
even
question.
more, some regions in the world where mining is very active, that sadly we have those situations.
This also gets us back to another question that we've discussed, which is, who are we mining for? What are the constellations of interests and benefits and burdens that will come out of these projects? And I just I use once again the rush for green energy minerals as an example. We have a great pressure to try to develop faster access to lithium as a resource everywhere in the world. There's pressure to produce lithium faster, permit lithium mines faster, and yet we go to the communities that are impacted. Let's just say the biggest lithium reserves are in the north of Chile. The communities that are most impacted seem to be very low income, isolated indigenous communities that live. They've remarkably adapted to the desert, and they've found ways to live there in subsistence that have, gone on for thousands of years, but which are fragile. And if you start fooling with the environment, where is the lithium going? At the end of the day, I don't think any of those people is going to have any lithium, right? So they're producing lithium at great inconvenience to themselves for people who are driving around in electric cars, and, like me. And but the question becomes, well, okay, so there's this enormous demand for lithium for electric cars. Who's got the electric cars? Well, people in high income countries have the electric cars. The people who are being impacted don't even have electricity. They don't have electric motorcycles. They don't have electric bicycles. They don't have electric anything. And they are the ones who are supposed to be suffering many of the burdens that we're in a situation where the impact on their subsistence livelihoods is real, but poorly understood by people who don't live that way. So, there's this question of equity. It's an equity and social justice question, as well as a permitting question of who are we to be asking people who are living at subsistence to inconvenience themselves for the well-being of, and they if they are aware of all these issues, will turn around and say, whose carbon emissions caused all this problem to begin with? Was it my carbon emissions? Oh, no, actually, you have almost no carbon emissions, right?
So,
and
yeah.
And so I'm the one who's doing the carbon emissions. I want to solve it by developing electric cars and driving around in them with massive amounts of lithium in the batteries. And, that somehow or other, we need to come to grips with that issue, both on a social justice level and on a question of, I suppose the question would be, do we not owe it to communities like that to make sure that if development is happening, they are going to come out of it better off by some measure that's meaningful to them? They need to be, I think, coming out of this ahead of the game if they're going to be suffering.
But that raises, of course, the question of, what is ahead of the game? That's a good question. From the point of view of a company that's coming in, or the government, while we're giving a real opportunity to these people to get good jobs, and they haven't had that, and that's ahead of the game. Well, they don't see that as being ahead of the game. That's behind the game. So we're always in a situation where these social justice and equity questions are huge. And then you have the argument, well, the real benefits are for the society at large. The country is at large. It's about foreign exchange. It's about our currency. It's about social benefits to the greatest number of people. And we can't take that into account in connection with a very limited number of folks. So these are imponderably difficult questions. But just to roam back into the point that you're making, Luke, who needs to be involved in what ways? now we have these people at the extremities and margins of these areas that have somehow managed to learn how to subsist there and live a life that they think is a good life, I hope. And then you have people inside a community in which you have the question that's very difficult and challenging. Well, who in the community is informed? Is the job to include just the chief and council or the mayor and council, or is it the wider set of folks that are engaged in it? These questions are all part of social justice questions, because if my interest is not being taken into account or my values are not figuring into this thing, it does raise inevitably questions of social justice and ethics, no matter what scale or level you're thinking about them, it seems to me. And they're not easy questions, and I don't think there's easy answers to them. Monica, your thoughts on this?
Well, I think that number one, we need to start what development is for the communities that are impacted, and what is a natural organic development for them. Because in so many cases, we just go back to the colonization days that we think that they should be Christians, and we think they need to wear dresses, and they think to have sewing machines. No, self-development is today we need to accept and recognize development comes in very different ways, and knowledge and the use of knowledge for subsistence is in a very different way. I'm not saying, and I want to be clear, that with many of the communities I had the privilege to work, many times I have indigenous leaders saying, we have more than feathers in our head. We have the ability, but we haven't had chances. And that is one of the elements that, since I have been working on this, I think that we need to take the responsibility of, they must be involved in what's development for them. And the project being there and social investment coming as a force should be development for the future. And this is when sustainable development comes in terms of accelerating the process. And accelerating the process means sometimes it's just road access to go to school, or sometimes accelerating the process is having the ability of having bilingual schools in their own region, in their very own language, and the country's language, Spanish, English, Portuguese, or so on. Development could be also the validity of their knowledge and traditional knowledge immersed into Western ways of doing. So we need to be careful on that, because sadly in so many projects we are seeing, I have seen projects that they bring computers, but the communities, they don't even have electricity. And that means that we don't understand development. And I have another case that was interesting, that they bring a full set of books in French to a villa in the middle of the Amazonia. So, and obviously, these guys, they don't appreciate, no, it's what to do with this gift. So we need to be careful on that. And that's the beauty of the impact assessment. So also, and what is a good job? What is a good job? So all of those things, when we go into regions, number one, we don't own 100%. We have the technical knowledge, but we're not going to live there in the next 30, 40, 50 years. So right. we want the regions to progress. And this is a critical element of the industry, because it goes linked to reputation. And we know the industry reputation is not the best. So all of this is to link together.
Let's just get into this a little deeper now. It seems to me that these questions about ethics are extremely challenging, and ethics really is also about a problem in which people can have different deeply held values around particular points of view. And the question is the process through which we engage in a discussion about ethical conflicts. That's also a key part of this, because if we don't allow people to give expression to the values that define who they are and allow them to articulate those, then the ethical overburden becomes too great. So I happen to believe, and have worked a lot on how do you negotiate between people with deeply held differences, ethical, moral differences? And the question is not conversion. We're not trying to convert each other. But the question is, can we find the jigsaw puzzle in the middle of those two competing poles that allow us to coexist in spite of our differences? That involves building trust, because I do not believe that we cannot coexist and find ways to coexist by building a vision of how we can fill the divide between those two positions. But these are complicated challenges, and sometimes I say to people, I have a board, and I say, okay, this is your scorecard, this is your scorecard. Each of you keep your own scorecard as to what you think we're building in the middle and how you would value it. It's a piece of land, it's a bridge, or it's this, or it's that, or it's some adjustment to the waterway. But the point is that our instinctive drive in kind of the disciplinary analytics that we use in everyday is we have to get a common set of understanding of what the issues are. Then we have to get a common set of parameters and analytics against which we measure them. We have to get a bunch of options available and pick the best option. And it simply can't solve the problem that way. I don't know, that's going off a little bit on a tangent here, but these are imponderably difficult and provoking questions, and I don't think they're brought to the surface enough, is what I'm saying, in some of these deliberations.
Well, Glenn, I think that when you just talk about values and understanding values, this is fundamental, because the conversation around values is what will define the basis for building trust.
Yeah.
And in many communities that have self-rule, because many times the government is not there and they don't have access to understand what is the legal or the regulatory frameworks in their own countries, they self-govern. And you have many communities that they trust by shaking hands. And they close deals for long term by doing that. So when we go to the regions and we say we are going to build a mine, we are going to build a mine. Or we say we are going to employ you, we're going to create jobs. You are going to create jobs because it's the only way they have. So that value around truth and trust is very similar. The thing is that we have a lot of complexities and agreements and documents and all of those things that will come in between, that for many communities, it is not even seen because they haven't seen it before. It's not because they are not capable of understanding. It's because they have never seen that before. It's not common in their environment. And I have seen people who just have a piece of paper that says, this is my land rights because I bought it from my brother. The legal framework of that country is not valid. So it is a lot of piece on that. And that, once again, is when communities in many regions are apprehensive of having mining at the first place, because other people had played with that. We might call it naiveness, or we might call it just as a very simple, straight relationship because that's what they have. So values on that, once again, I think that one of the challenges, and I will say, is the arrogance that we have, that we expect communities, regardless indigenous and traditional communities, we expect them to jump up to our level of education or understanding. And I will argue that it's our duty to have the ability to understand the level and bring our knowledge and our way of communication to the level that we are understood, not to the level that we want to be understood. And we're not doing that. And communication is clear. And the only basis for communication to progress is values. So I think that what you just say is so powerful and very important that we need to be clear around. And that goes part of the early engagement process, to understand what are the codes, how they self-govern, what is valid for them, what is not valid. Yeah. And all of that understanding will define that one.
We accept promises from institutions often, and if the head of the the I don't know what, the school system comes to us and says, this is what we're going to do, you can count on it. Then if you go back next week and they say, oh, well, he's not here anymore, we got somebody new, you expect the person that is the replacement to honor the promises, because we deal with institutions. And in a lot of developing countries, particularly in subsistence communities, they don't operate that way. You know, their relationship is with Monica, because she's the one who's been talking to them. And if one day they say, oh, Monica's not here anymore, but meet Glenn. Glenn is her replacement. They're very concerned and don't know what to do. And really, a lot of our institutions in the mining industry and in government have not been, you know, my values can be terrific. But if I then wind up being replaced by somebody who has very different values, suddenly we're expecting the community to adjust to that. There's really a problematic issue there, is to what extent can we actually sit there and make promises to people if we are aware that, in a year and a half, my rotation into this job is over. And at that point, I will be going back to headquarters somewhere and someone else will take the job. To what extent can I make those promises in a way that is authentic and reliable?
Well, and that's where I think we come to a very fundamental part of this whole conversation. It's one thing to build a relationship between people, but it's another thing to build a relationship between organizations, groups, companies, and communities. And that's the issue. How do we take on board the reality that if we're going to just rely on interpersonal relations as the foundation for building a more resilient relationship, we won't succeed. So we really now have to understand how the individual and the organizational culture in which they operate work, and what can I rely upon reciprocally. And to start that, like any relationship, I think you have to be transparent about the way you make decisions and who's involved and in what way within the chief and council and the community, or within the local government and its community and how it reaches, or between the labor union and whether the operating manager of the union can make a deal, or whether it has to go to a vote, or how the company makes its decisions. So I think the first step is to say relationships between people are good, but not good enough. And that really takes us into some fundamental questions about understanding who in the hell we are as organizations and what we can and cannot commit to. Your point is so profound on that a minute ago, and so exact. Every organization has about a third of its people migrate out every 33 years or something like that. That's just the way it is. And that's not the way a community works. So this whole business, to me, when we talk about discussions, you have to share what the culture and the decision-making processes are going to be in this thing, because there's nothing more aggravating than being told when you think you've been dealing with somebody that can make a decision that, well, now I have to take it to the board of directors, or I have to do that. Well, why did you tell me that before, that was going to take 4 more months? I didn't know that. Or the same thing inside a company with a team, and they're being pulled into some meeting about an operational issue, and suddenly at the end of the meeting, they thought they were there to resolve the issue. The guy that called the meeting says, well, thanks a lot for your energy, boys. I'm off now to make a decision, and I'm going to consult a few more people. And nobody knows, well, what were we doing here in the first place? So there's so many things that we struggle to deal with in terms of these big picture issues about mineral development, higher development, all the resource projects we have going on, that ultimately boil down to us, the way we work as people, the way we work as organizations. That's what it's all about. It's not about the mine. It's about us. on our structures and our organizations and our fears and suspicions of each other. That's really, in the world in which I live, it's never been about the mine. Never been about that. It's all about the organizations and the cultures around the mine and the property that are the issue. And I don't think we take that on board as problem number one enough.
It's true. It's really true. I mean, it's us, and I will say that it's our ego and that's the biggest problem, because that's when we stop listening with our ears and our eyes and our senses and everything. And because we know we hold the truth. We are the big scientists and the big engineers and the big financiers, and you're a community with a piece of land. And I come here to change your life and create a better future. So we haven't disattached ourselves for the colonization mentality, and that is a huge issue. And that is because we are, or the religious piece, no? This is actually kind of a religious piece too. It's like, who holds the truth? And we don't. We are technical people who can do this in a region that is yours, and I don't have experience in your region. That's what should be, but sadly it's not.
You know, I look back on one of the projects I've been involved in as a profound source of insight in examples. I suppose that the first point I'd make would be to say, look, we're talking about a community that was living very isolated in one of the most beautiful and biodiverse jungles I've ever seen in the north of Panama on the Atlantic coast. And the people in that community they were indigenous people, and they'd lived on the indigenous reserve. They got converted to evangelical Christianity by some fire-breathing preacher, and they wound up preaching at everybody to the point that the other indigenous people told them, we don't want you around anymore, and they left, and they trekked off into the jungle, and they eventually found a place where they thought that conditions were right, and they cut certain trees and they kept certain trees, and the soils were poor like rainforest soils tend to be, and they found all kind of sources of compost, and they built the soil up, and they got to the point where after a decade they'd built houses, everything was very nice, and in came a mining company, and the mining company said, you need to leave because we have a gold concession on this area and you need to go away. And when the people expressed concern about that, the company guards came out and burned all their houses to the ground and told them, if you're anybody who's here tomorrow, we'll kill you. So they wandered off into the jungle again, and a very remote and very beautiful place. And once again, they spent years fixing it up, getting the soil good, getting the trees harvested, and basically developing a sustainable livelihood for themselves, when the people I was working with discovered the biggest copper deposit in Central America right under where they're living. Right. And so now somebody in the company has to go to these people and talk to them and tell them they're going to have to move again. And there were people in the company who said, I'm not going to do that. It's just not right that these people have to experience this. And you can do it if you want, but I'm not going to go tell them that they're going to have to move because I think it's an outrage. And so I look at that and I say, well, there are all these conflicting values, right? And it is an outrage. And in a fair and just world, they wouldn't be asked to move again for the third time. So they, just to make this story have some ending, ultimately, of course, people did talk to them and did tell them they were going to have to move, and did start, I think, in a very reasonable way, talking to them about what are your houses going to be like and where can you live and what can we do to, but in the middle of all this, one of my colleagues turned to all the people who were at this big consultation meeting and said, "We're coming to the lunch break. I'd like you to go back to your houses, and when you come back, bring everything you have that's made out of copper." And they came back, and all of the copper in the village of 600 or 700 people fit in 2 hats. Right, a couple of coins, a few pieces of wire, a piece or 2 of jewelry, and they're now supposed to be moving because
Right.
you know, and they don't have any copper at all. Somebody in the corporate PR department suddenly looked at this and said, "Holy shit! If somebody starts to publicize this, it's going to be brutal. So we need to get them some copper." So they immediately said, "Oh, and your new village is going to be electrified. It's going to have electric wires, and you're going to have solar collectors and batteries." But it's just it's an astonishing set of.
But so you've picked a very dramatic example that sounds like it's over there somewhere. It's somewhere else. It's somewhere in a jungle. But those stories are very much capable of being drawn very close to home. Now, as we've been moving along our trajectory here in our last conversation, there's no doubt that there's been massive developments in terms of the interface between the communities, government, resource projects of a variety of kind over the last 25 years, particularly, or 20, but it's been a gradually evolving curve. But if you go back into Canada, 1955, when the first hydroelectric developments were being contemplated along the Winnipeg River, which is between Ontario and Manitoba in the center of the country, a close friend of mine, and he was the chief of the band that I was dealing with on the mercury contamination cases in Northern Ontario. He was a young boy, and he was walking along the river where where their humble community was, and he saw some guy with a pole and a thing on it at the top that looked like well, he didn't know what it was, a camera or a set of lens or something. I can't remember how he described it. And he went up and asked these guys what they were doing in the best way he could communicate. He didn't speak very much English. And the guy said, "Well, you better get the hell out of here. We're coming to flood this place in 2 weeks." "What do you mean you're coming to flood it?" He said, "I'm telling you, get the hell out of here, because that's what's going to happen." Well, that's exactly what happened. 2 weeks later, they flooded it. Now, you can go further and take that whole evolution of hydroelectric development in northern Canada, which has been largely run by large crown corporations, and you can see one of the most complex kind of dynamics that occur between people and the landscape because of the magnitude of those projects and the sweep of them. But the reality has been that the people in those places did not even get electricity from the dam, because the substations to take the power from the big generating lines was so expensive. So many of these communities that might have had hydroelectric power were not even being given access to them, even though that's the area of the dams. That's changed, I'm sure, today. But the one thing that has happened in the Canadian setting, in the Canadian context, is power has changed. Power has changed dramatically. And with it, you have to switch on the whole business of time, values, and everything, because ultimately it's easy to talk about dialogue, conversations, but you know something? To be taken seriously, if you're gonna have a serious discussion of any kind, you have to be taken seriously. And the reality of all of what we're talking about can never be divorced from the fundamental reality of the changing power equation. And that has been shaping much of the last 25 years. So when we started here, we were thinking about the whole question of implementation and how, are things getting done? Are things changing? I would say that the biggest thing that's causing change is the changing power equation. And when that changes, the biggest challenge you then have is how you turn power in the form of rights, if that's what it is, or power in the form of economic, whatever the medium of power is. It ultimately is about how we turn those rights and how that you use that power to effect good results, good outcomes, how we get results. And that's another whole element of the equity and value-based discussions we were having. What about power?
What a fascinating discussion this has been. We've covered everything from the impact of project deadlines on Indigenous communities to the necessity of trust building through early engagement and the role of power dynamics in these relationships. Glenn and Luke, thank you both so much for sharing your wisdom today. Our listeners will walk away with a deeper understanding of the challenges we face in balancing corporate urgency with the long-term impacts on communities and ecosystems.
The conversation we had today really highlights the needs for more thoughtful, patient, and respectful dialogues in mining and development projects. The value of time and how it's managed can make or break a project, but it's also a reflection of how we build trust and foster sustainable partnerships. The podcast concluded with reflections on how changing power dynamics within the mining industry, driven by the legal recognition of Indigenous rights and community advocacy, reshape the landscape for sustainable mining practices and community relations. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in. We hope this episode gives you plenty to think about.
So the mining industry is facing a pivotal moment. With the global energy transition, with climate change, and with the growing demand for critical minerals, mining companies are being asked to play a key role in shaping a more sustainable and equitable future. But how do we balance these demands with the realities on the ground? In our final episode, Mónica and I will take a step back to reflect on everything we've covered and to look ahead to where the mining industry is headed. Join us as we explore the big picture in Podcast 12, integrating the lessons of the past and charting the path forward.